Hello, and welcome to Instant Insights, Global Data Strategic Intelligence podcast. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all sectors. I'm Lara Williams, and today we're looking at the thorny issue of AI regulation, examining the different approaches and asking whether there's a middle ground for an issue that's become so polarising. Today we're hosted by UK-based law firm Bristows, overlooking the River Thames, and my guest is Simon McDougall. Simon is a former Deputy Commissioner at the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, Chief Strategist for Privacy and AI at ZoomInfo, and an International Fellow at Yale University's Digital Ethics Centre, and an advisor for Bristows, amongst other firms. So Simon, let's dive straight in. I wonder if we could start with you outlining the different approaches of the UK, EU and US on AI regulation and where we are now broadly in terms of statutory obligations for companies developing AI products and services.
Absolutely, and it is a complicated picture, but bear with me on this one. I think the first thing to say is that, all of AI regulation right now is informed by recent events, going back to ChatGPT 3.5 and LLMs. So it's all very fast moving, much more fast moving than most new regulation. It's taken less time to get where we are. But we're now in a funny situation where the European Union has its own omnibus comprehensive legislation, the EU AI Act, and is going through the motions of implementing that, different stages, different phases. We'll talk about what that looks like in a second. So they're kind of going in and rolling in and issuing guidelines and et cetera, as they go. You then have the US, which if anything is kind of pulling out of regulation. They had the White House executive order, which was basically a order from the former President Biden, which obliged public bodies to follow certain standards. And in doing so, we're starting to set a kind of set of expectations for the whole market, because obviously if you set them for the public sector, everyone starts to follow over time. And that's been cancelled by the Trump administration. So that's going in the other direction. And then you've got the UK in the middle. And the UK was talking about doing some kind of AI regulation, but really is probably cooling off on that slightly and is leaning towards using existing regulation with existing regulators. So the EU is rolling in, the US is rolling out, and the UK staying kind of the same.
You have said publicly before that there's a genuine opportunity for the UK to chart a third way, a kind of striking a balance between the EU's comprehensive approach and the volatility of the US. Do you think it's feasible for the UK to maintain a kind of pragmatic middle ground?
I think it is. I'm optimistic about that, Lara. I think it's hard to know exactly where the middle ground is when, especially in the US, it's a very volatile environment, so policy positions might change quickly. So what exactly is the middle might change in that respect. I can't say I was a tremendous fan of Brexit as a thing, but I have to say in this context there might be a bit of a Brexit dividend, quite a rare beast, a Brexit dividend, but I think there might be a Brexit dividend.
Careful, you might upset the Remainers.
I know. I hesitate to say this. When I say this in public, half the crowd kind of kind of quite unhappy with me. But what I mean by that is the EU AI Act is a very particular beast, and in some ways it may be overly complicated, and indeed the EU itself is shrinking away from aspects of it, which I can go into in a minute. And so the UK has a bit of flexibility there, where it's obviously not obliged to pursue that particular blueprint, but it can do something which is a bit more proportionate and risk-based and thoughtful. So there is an opportunity there, and if they grasp that opportunity, that it might be we can end up with a stable UK environment with some sensible rules and some sensible expectations from the existing regulators, which is a bit easier to manage than having no ground rules at all, but also a bit easier to manage than having lots of complicated rules.
I know things are changing day to day at the moment with the news cycle over the Atlantic in the US. But if you had a crystal ball, what would you say about US AI regulation and what's likely to come down the line? Are we likely to end up with a centralised federal regulatory framework, or do you think we'll end up with a set of fragmented AI regulations as various federal agencies independently develop their policies? And kind of either way, is this light touch position ensured?
I think that it's not necessarily, that's a slightly false dichotomy, Lara, in terms of, I don't think it's about federal law and federal agencies. It's more about federal versus state.
Okay.
So what we're going to have is really at the federal level. Right now, it's quite likely there's going to be a bit of a void for a while. And in the end, events, maybe some bad things will happen and then there'll be a response to that. But right now, what you're seeing is a dismantling of some federal agencies and a kind of a slowing down of others. And likewise, no great appetite for new federal law. But what happens, and this is a very common dynamic, it's what we've seen with, say, security breach regulation, and indeed with privacy regulation. If there's no federal law, then many US states over time go, okay, well, we'll do it ourselves. And so you see, you already have like New York, Colorado, you already have some states which have AI law of various kinds, often focus on specific use cases such as recruitment, and lots of other proposals in play for that. And so that's kind of filling a bit of a void. So I'm not expecting the US to do anything especially proactive at a federal level on AI regulation, and I'm not expecting regulators such as the FTC to do anything especially proactive, but I am expecting states over time to step up and have some particular regulation. Now, obviously for, companies that have business across America, let alone across the world, that's a real burden.
Yeah.
But given where we are, as with privacy, you have that kind of tension, and it would make more sense to have something which is standardized across the US, but bridging the political gap to get there is very hard. So we may end up with just a patchwork of state regulation.
Okay, thanks. Just a small segue, because you mentioned false dichotomies. What do you make of the view that light touch regulation is seen as pro-business, and is that an accurate calculation?
It really does depend. I think that's definitely the mood music right now, far more so than in recent years. And it's interesting how whilst there's some very different ideologies, excuse me, different ideologies and different, viewpoints in play, you are seeing a big deregulatory push from the EU, from the UK and the US. And I appreciate we're kind of trying to keep our focus on those three areas right now. So we've got to all acknowledge we're excluding big chunks of the world in this perspective. But so in the EU before the last set of elections, you had something called the Draghi report. So Draghi was a former commissioner who basically said, hey guys, you know what, if we don't get economic growth, then it's very hard to pursue the other objectives the EU has. And this world we are in right now, there's a range of issues, but it includes regulation, is stopping us achieving meaningful economic growth. And that report has been largely accepted within Brussels, kind of generalising wildly here, obviously. The UK election was all about growth, and this current government is really focused on growth as a way, and it needs to increase growth and productivity if it's going to pay for new hospitals and just redistribute wealth. And obviously in the US, there's a strong focus on the US economy. So they're all kind of going at this idea that we need lighter touch regulation in order to support growth, even though they're coming from slightly different ideologies. I've got to say personally, I have a lot of sympathy for that on some levels. There's lots of different use cases where there's just so much complexity because there's so many well-meaning rules that overlap with each other that if you're trying to build a startup in fintech or health, good rules overlap with bad rules, and it's just hard to get things going. At the same time, what I find businesses really want is consistency and simplicity. And that's not the same as having no regulation. What they don't want is tinkering year in, year out. Most businesses that I dealt with as a regulator, as deputy commissioner, or have dealt with in my business career, have been okay to say, look, give us the rules and we'll work to them. But we just want to get on with it. So what we don't want to do is have to second guess what's going to happen next year and the year after and the year after. And we don't want the goalpost to be changed by well-meaning folk all the way through. So consistency is a big thing. So I think consistency and stability are the key words rather than light touch or heavy duty.
If we're talking about consistency, how far has the UK government moved from its manifesto promise on AI regulation? I mean, we saw in the King's speech, it was very much a promise to establish a robust AI regulation framework. And we seem to have shifted towards the US approach. How far do you think that's a function of geopolitical issues, or how much is it to do with the government's growth agenda?
So reading between the lines, I think the UK position has shifted a bit, but I wouldn't necessarily characterise it as shifting towards the US position per se. I think the notion, it's strange actually that the coming into government, this government's position was quite similar to the previous government's position in terms of saying, okay, we are going to have some regulation. It's going to focus on frontier AI. It's going to focus on the cutting edge and where we think there is existential risk. So the focus of this government and the previous government has been on frontier AI. The idea that we need to worry about killer robots and existential risk through kind of real advances in artificial intelligence that start to supersede human intelligence. And both Rishi Sunak and that administration and the current administration were quite focused on that, and less so on the kind of big range of stuff in the EU. I think that the appetite to actually regulate in this area has waned a little bit within government. And so whilst there's absolutely been a lot of thinking about frontier AI, I don't think it's a rush to actually produce new law on it. But where it is still different from the US, I think, is that this government is very actively looking towards the regulators that already exist. So talking about the Information Commissioner's Office, Ofcom, the sector regulators like the FCA, to say, okay, you should be engaging on AI issues and you should be actively regulating. And that's where it differs very much from the US, where, some regulators such as the CFPB are effectively being wound down, and other regulators such as the FTC are going to go, be much less proactive in what they do.
So the UK is proactive in creating robust institutions to regulate.
Yes, but I think they want to use existing institutions rather than new institutions.
Okay.
So if you see what's going on within the EU right now, then it's very complicated. But most countries are having to name 8 or 9 different regulators to fulfill different aspects of the EU AI Act. It's going to be very complicated.
Does that feed in at all to the government's decision to rebrand the AI Safety Institute as the AI Security Institute?
I think it is all linked up, and that maybe is a reflection that there's a little less focus on the existential risk question. But it's also just the mood of the times. So I was in Paris for the AI summit, 2 or 3 weeks ago now. And, the first couple of iterations of that in Bletchley Park in the UK, in Seoul, were very focused on existential risks. And now there's this feeling that, well, we've got to harness AI to support economic growth and stay competitive with other parts of the world. And maybe we've got a little more acquainted with some of these risks. Now, personally, I think that some of those risks are now being underplayed slightly. I think we've kind of gone too far in the other direction. I think some of those risks are entirely legitimate, and it's almost unfashionable to be worried about AI nowadays. But the fact remains, people aren't talking about AI safety. And the AI Security Institute is trying to position itself as a global institute working with the very large technology platforms. So it's got to kind of have the right terminology to actually, kind of work with everybody. And safety was starting to become a slightly loaded term.
I see. You mentioned earlier that the UK is not necessarily following the US approach, but the UK did side with the US at the Action Summit that you were present at. And they were both outliers. What did you make of that?
It was a funny one. I think in practice, everyone knew the US were not going to sign up to anything before the summit. And given the current administration's position on international cooperation, it was hard to visualize there being some kind of compromise reached between the different countries involved. So to me, it was not really that interesting a question for who was signing up or not signing up, because if you don't have the US signing up around AI, then it's all goodwill for everybody else, but it's not something which is going to be compelling. So it's hard, and at the same time, the UK is absolutely trying to find a space, and I think has the opportunity to find a space where it can be an interlocutor between the various other players, and we're focusing right now for simplicity on UK, US, EU, but obviously China is a massive player. So to kind of be that kind of broker is important. It was really interesting how with Bletchley Park, at the time, it was seen as a massive achievement to get China and the US to sign the Bletchley Declaration. And which was a fairly anodyne statement, but just getting those two superpowers who are competing very hard in AI to sign something together was an achievement. So maybe that's what we should be looking for as the next thing is just getting some level of international consensus again, and then we can go from there.
There was the question of optics, though, that the UK appeared to be siding with the US. Does that not harm their position of taking that kind of middle ground?
I think there's always a risk that there's harm from any position when it's such a loaded and divisive discussion right now. And at the same time, I think the UK is doing a very good job in AI and tech of actually engaging and feeding into the policy discussion. And this is another role that I think the AI Security Institute has, is it's real products, real hours, it's real analysis, they're doing real work on models. So in that respect, there's a space and a role to play. And I didn't get the impression, and I'm not a diplomat, I'm not representing the UK government, etc., etc. So I'm purely my impression of events. I didn't get the impression that bridges were burned through that position. Okay. In that there might be some noses put out of joint in the short run, but if you look at the rest, if you step aside and look at outside of AI to the rest of geopolitics right now, there's far more extreme positions and situations happening almost on a daily basis as we speak that make that particular move seem fairly benign.
And just to finish off, what would your advice to businesses be navigating this kind of volatile space and moving forward without certainty?
Well, I think the first thing is to utilise your wise words there and say, okay, except there isn't going to be certainty, and there won't be certainty for a while. So it's not a matter of making a really good guess on what's going to happen and then being very fixed about it. It has to be iterative. I think it really, really depends on the footprint and ambition of your business. Stating the obvious, it was a big, if you are within scope of the EU AI Act, then that's the biggest, hairiest, scariest bit of regulation in this space right now. And so in that respect, there's a big question there. And this is where it differs, I think, from, say, the GDPR as a counterpoint. With the GDPR, really, anyone who's doing any meaningful business in the EU will be processing personal data. And if you did that, then the set of things you had to do was fairly fixed. It was a big checklist, but it was a checklist. When with the EU AI Act, it makes a massive difference if you're doing high-risk processing. It makes a massive difference if you are using general-purpose AI. So there's some big forks in the road. So if you're a business, the main things you need to be doing is having a think about, okay, are any of my products within the EU, are they possibly high-risk? Are they possibly general-purpose? Because if any of the answers to those are yes, then you might have a lot of work to do. And if they're not, it's a fairly benign piece of regulation. Elsewhere, I think it's a matter of just watching the press, seeing what's happening, but also keeping in mind that AI-specific regulation takes up a lot of airtime right now, but there's lots of other regulation that will affect what you do. So I've mentioned privacy regulation. If it's processing personal data, whether it's AI or not, privacy regulation, got sector-specific regulation, and very often using AI in interesting ways might actually trigger interesting situations for the other regulation. You might go, oh my gosh, we need to actually explain to people what we're doing over here. We're now making an automated decision that has to be, that it triggers GDPR in some way. So it would be dangerous to go, okay, I'm using AI and there's no AI regulation, therefore there's no regulation. That's not the case. There's other stuff going on.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much for your time and for your valuable insights. And thank you to all of you for listening. From us at Global Data Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.